I'm Jeff Brown, and I wrote Flat Stanley. I'd like to read it to you now. Breakfast was ready. "I will go wake up the boys," Mrs. Lambchop said to her husband, George Lambchop. Just then, their younger son, Arthur, called from the bedroom. "Hey, come and look! Hey!" Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop went into the bedroom. "Hay is for horses, Arthur, not people," Mr. Lambchop said. "Try to remember that." "Excuse me," Arthur said, "but look." He pointed to his brother Stanley's bed. Stanley's big bulletin board had fallen on top of him while he was asleep. But Stanley was not hurt. In fact, he had gone right on sleeping until he heard Arthur shouting. "What's going on here?" Stanley called out cheerfully from under the bulletin board. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop lifted up the board. "Heavens," said Mrs. Lambchop. "Gosh," said Arthur. "Stanley's flat." "As a pancake," said Mr. Lambchop. "Darndest thing I've ever seen." "Let's all have breakfast," Mrs. Lambchop said. "Then I will take Stanley to see Dr. Dan." "How do you feel, Stanley?" Dr. Dan asked. "Does it hurt very much?" "I felt sort of tickly for a while," Stanley Lambchop said. "But I feel fine now." "Well, that's mostly how it is with these cases," said Dr. Dan. Mrs. Lambchop said that Stanley would need new clothes now, but it would be hard to find the right size. Dr. Dan's nurse measured Stanley. He was 4 feet tall, about a foot wide, and half an inch thick. When Stanley got used to being flat, he enjoyed it. He could go in and out of rooms even when the door was closed. He would just lie down and slide through the crack at the bottom. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop were quite proud of him. Arthur got jealous and tried to slide under a door too, but he just banged his head. Being flat could also be a help, Stanley found. He was taking a walk with Mrs. Lambchop one afternoon when her best ring fell from her finger. The ring rolled across the sidewalk and down between the bars of a grating. Mrs. Lambchop began to cry. "I have an idea," Stanley said. He took the laces out of his shoes and another pair out of his pocket. He tied them all together to make one long lace. Then he tied the end of that to the back of his belt and gave the other end to his mother. "Lower me," he said, "and I will look for the ring." "Thank you, Stanley," Mrs. Lambchop said. She let him down between the bars and moved him up and down and from side to side. 2 policemen came by and stared at Mrs. Lambchop. "What's the matter, lady?" the first policeman asked. "Is your yo-yo stuck?" "I am not playing with a yo-yo," Mrs. Lambchop said. "My son is at the other end of this shoelace, if you must know." "Get the net, Harry," said the second policeman. "We have caught a cuckoo." Just then Stanley cried out, "Hooray!" Mrs. Lambchop pulled him up. He was holding the ring. "Good for you, Stanley," she said. Then she turned to the policeman. "A cuckoo indeed," she said. "Shame." "We are sorry, lady," the policeman said. "People should think twice before saying rude things," said Mrs. Lambchop. "And then they should not say them at all." One day Stanley got a letter from his friend Thomas Anthony Jeffrey, whose family had moved to California. Thomas wanted Stanley to visit him. "Oh boy," Stanley said, "I would love to go." Mr. Lambchop sighed. "A round-trip train or airplane ticket to California costs a lot of money," he said. "I will have to think of some cheaper way." That evening, Mr. Lambchop brought home a very large brown paper envelope. "Now then, Stanley," he said, "try this for size." The envelope fit Stanley very well. There was even room left over for an egg salad sandwich made with thin bread and a flat cigarette case filled with note. They had to put a great many stamps on the envelope, but it was still much cheaper than a train or airplane ticket to California. The next day, Mr. Lambchop put Stanley into his envelope. Mrs. Lambchop put in the egg salad sandwich and the cigarette case full of note. They mailed him from the box on the corner. The envelope had to be folded to fit through the slot, but once he was inside the box, Stanley straightened right up again. Mrs. Lambchop was worried because Stanley had never been away from home alone before. She tapped on the box. "Can you hear me, dear?" she called. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Stanley called back. "Can I eat my sandwich now?" "Wait an hour, and try not to get too warm, dear," Mrs. Lambchop said. Then she and Mr. Lambchop cried out, "Goodbye, goodbye," and went home. Stanley had a fine time in California. When the visit was over, the Jeffreys sent him home in a beautiful white airmail envelope they had made themselves. They wrote, "This end up," on both sides. Mr. Lambchop had always liked to take the boys out walking with him on Sunday afternoons. but it was hard when they were crossing streets or moving about in crowds. It was easier after Stanley got flat. Mr. Lambchop found that he could roll Stanley up without hurting him at all. He would tie a piece of string around Stanley to keep him from unrolling and make a little loop in the string. Then he could carry Stanley like a package and hold on to Arthur with the other hand. Stanley did not mind because he had never much liked to walk. Arthur didn't like to walk either, but he had to. It made him mad. One Sunday afternoon, they met an old friend of Mr. Lambchop's, a man he had not seen for years. "Well, George, I see you have some wallpaper," the man said. "Going to fix up the house, I suppose." "Wallpaper?" said Mr. Lambchop. "Oh, no. This is my son, Stanley." He undid the string, and Stanley unrolled. "How do you do?" Stanley said. "Nice to meet you, young fellow," the man said. He said to Mr. Lambchop, "George, that boy is flat." "Smart, too," Mr. Lambchop said. "Stanley is third from the top in his class at school." "Phooey," said Arthur. "This is my other son, Arthur," Mr. Lambchop said. "He is not always so rude." Arthur blushed and said he was sorry. Mr. Lambchop rolled Stanley up again, and they set out for home. It began to rain. Stanley, of course, got wet just around the edges, but Arthur got soaked. Late that night, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop heard a noise in the living room. They found Arthur on the floor near the bookcase. He had put a great many heavy books on top of himself. "Put some more on me," Arthur said when he saw them. "Don't just stand there. Help me." Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop sent him back to bed. But the next morning, they talked to Stanley. "Arthur can't help being jealous," they said. "Be nice to him. You're his big brother, after all." Stanley and Arthur were in the park. Many boys were flying beautiful big kites with long tails. Arthur sighed. "Someday," he said, "I will have a big kite, and I will win a kite-flying contest and be famous like everyone else. Nobody knows who I am these days." Stanley remembered what his parents had said. He went to a boy whose kite was broken and borrowed some string. "You can fly me, Arthur," he said. "Come on." He tied the string to himself and gave Arthur the other end to hold. He ran across the grass, sideways to get up speed, and then he turned to meet the wind. Up, 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 up went Stanley, being a kite. He knew just how to fly. He faced full into the wind if he wanted to go up, and let it take him from behind when he wanted to go fast. He had only to turn his thin edge to the wind a little at a time, and then he would zoom down toward the earth again. Arthur let out all the string, and Stanley flew high above the trees. He was a beautiful sight in his green sweater and brown trousers against the pale blue sky. Everyone in the park stood still to watch. Stanley flew right and then left in long matched swoops. He zoomed at the ground like a rocket and turned up again toward the sun. He made circles and eights and crosses and a star. Nobody ever flew the way Stanley Lambchop flew that day. After a while, Arthur got tired of running about with the end of the string. Stanley went right on, though, showing off. 3 boys came up to Arthur and asked him to go with them for a hot dog. Arthur left the string tied to a tree. He did not notice that the wind was blowing the string and getting it all tangled up in the tree. The string got shorter and shorter, but Stanley did not know how low he was until leaves touched his feet. Then it was too late. He was caught in the branches. 15 minutes passed before Arthur and the other boys heard his cries and climbed up to set him free.
Come on.
That evening at bedtime, Arthur said he was sorry, but Stanley was still cross.
Stanley.
Mr. and Mrs. O.J. Dart lived in the apartment above the Lambchops. Mr. Dart was the head of the famous Museum of Art. At breakfast one morning, Stanley heard his mother and father talking about Mr. Dart. Mr. Lambchop was reading his newspaper. "I see," said Mr. Lambchop, "that another painting has been stolen from the famous museum. The newspaper says that Mr. O.J. Dart is at his wit's end. The police are no help. Listen to what the chief of police told the newspaper. We think it is a gang of sneak thieves. These are the worst kind. They work by sneakery, which makes them very hard to catch. However, my men and I will keep trying." The next morning, Stanley Lambchop heard Mr. Dart talking to his wife in the elevator. "These sneak thieves are very tricky," Mr. Dart said. "They work at night. And the museum is so big we cannot guard every picture at the same time. I fear it is hopeless, hopeless, hopeless. Suddenly, Stanley had an idea. He told it to Mr. Dart. Stanley, Mr. Dart said, if your mother says it is all right, I will put you and your plan to work this very night. Mrs. Lambchop said it was all right. But you will have to take a long nap this afternoon, she said. I won't have you up till all hours unless you do.